justification could in principle consist in a corresponding increase in positive freedom. The positive expressive freedom, the freedom to do something, that's obtainable only by constraining oneself by the conceptual norms implicit in discursive social practices, in speaking a public language, is a central case where such a justification evidently is available. Speaking a particular language requires complying with a daunting variety of norms, rules, and standards, and the result of failure to comply with enough of them is unintelligibility. That fact can recede so far into the background as to be well nigh invisible for our home languages, but it's an obtrusive, unpleasant, and unavoidable feature of working in a language in which one is not, in that sense, at home. And the same phenomenon is manifest in texts that intentionally violate even a relatively small number of central grammatical and semantic norms. You might think of Gertrude Stein's prose here. But the kind of positive freedom that one gets in return for constraining oneself in these multifarious ways is distinctive and remarkable. The astonishing empirical observation with which Chomsky inaugurated contemporary linguistic theory is that almost every sentence uttered by an adult native speaker is radically novel. That is, not only has that speaker never heard or uttered just that sequence of words before, but neither has anyone else, ever. Have a nice day may get a lot of play in the States, noch eins in Germany, and Gadai here, but any tolerably complex sentence is almost bound to be new. Quotation aside, it is, for instance, exceptionally unlikely that anyone else has ever used a sentence chosen at random from the story I've been telling, and that's not a special property just of professor speak. Surveys of large corpora of actual utterances, collected and collated by indefatigable graduate students, have repeatedly confirmed this empirically, and it can be demonstrated on more fundamental grounds by looking at the number of sentences of, say, 30 words or less that even a relatively simple grammar can construct using the extremely minimal 5,000-word vocabulary of basic English. Your vocabulary is more like 50,000 words. There just hasn't been time in human history for us to have used a substantial proportion of those sentences, even if every human being there had been had spoken English and did nothing but chatter incessantly. Yet I have no trouble producing, and you have no trouble understanding, a sentence that in spite of its ordinariness, it's quite unlikely that anyone else has ever happened to use before, such as, we shouldn't leave for the picnic until we're sure that we've packed my old wool blanket, the thermos, and all the sandwiches we made this morning. This capacity for radical semantic novelty fundamentally distinguishes sapient creatures from those who do not engage in linguistic practices. Because of it, we can, and do all the time, make claims, formulate desires, and entertain goals that no one in the history of the world has ever before so much as considered. This massive positive expressive freedom transforms the lives of sentient creatures who become sapient by constraining themselves by linguistic, which is to say conceptual norms. So, in the conceptual normativity implicit in linguistic practice, we have a model of a kind of constraint, a loss of negative freedom, that's repaid many times over in a bonanza of positive freedom. Anyone who is in a position to consider the trade-off rationally would consider it a once-in-a-lifetime bargain. Of course, one need not be a creature like us. As Sellers says, one could always simply not speak, but only at the cost of having nothing to say. And non-sapient sentients are, after all, hardly in a position to weigh the pros and cons involved. But the fact remains there is an argument that shows that at least this sort of normative constraint is rational from the point of view of the individual, that it pays off by opening up a dimension of positive freedom that's a pearl without price, available in no other way. Hegel's idea is that this case provides the model that every other social or political institution that proposes to constrain our negative freedom should be compared to and measured against. The question for him always is, what new kind of expressive freedom, what new kinds of life possibilities, what new kinds of commitment, responsibility, and authority are made possible by this institution? His strategy is to use an understanding of the basic metaphysical structure of mind, meaning, and rationality as the basis for normative assessment of lives and institutions. Now, I said a while back that it may seem that I was dragging the notion of freedom in kicking and screaming into a semantic and pragmatic discussion. I hope it doesn't seem like that now. But I want to close by mentioning a topic that initially, no doubt, seems still further removed, at least from issues of personal autonomy and political freedom, if not from semantics, namely alethic modality. Kant read Hume's practical and theoretical philosophies as raising variants on a single question. On the side of practical reasoning, Hume asks what our warrant is for moving from descriptions of how things are to prescriptions of how they ought to be. How can we rationally justify the move from is to ought? On the side of theoretical reasoning, Hume asks what our warrant is for moving from descriptions of what in fact happens to characterizations of what must happen and what could not happen. How can we rationally justify the move from descriptions of matter-of-factual regularities to formulations of necessary laws? In Kant's terminology, these are both species of necessity, moral or practical on the one hand, and natural necessity, respectively. For Kant, necessary, notwendig, just means according to a rule. Hume's predicament, in Kant's term, is that he finds that even his best understanding of facts doesn't yield an understanding of rules governing and relating those facts, underwriting assessments of which of the things that actually happen, something we can experience, ought to happen, that is, are normatively necessary, or must happen, are modally or naturally necessary. Kant's response, in a nutshell, is that Hume's predicament is not a real one. It's the product of a confusion. One cannot, in fact, fully understand the descriptive empirical employment of ordinary determinate concepts, say cat, without at least implicitly understanding also what's made explicit by the modal concepts that articulate laws. Hume thinks he can understand what it is to say the cat is on the mat without understanding what it means to say that it's possible for the cat to be elsewhere, but necessary that it not be larger than the earth. Kant's claim, put in contemporary terms, is that part of what one's committed to in applying any determinate concept in empirical circumstances is a distinction between counterfactual differences in circumstances that would, and those that would not, affect the truth of the judgment one is making. It would still be true that the cat is on the mat if the lighting were subtly different, but it wouldn't be true that the cat is on the mat if the force of gravity were 2 orders of magnitude stronger than it in fact is. And if you don't understand that, you don't grasp the concept cat. Hume frames his question as an epistemological one, concerning the justification of our claims to know what must happen, or what ought to happen, based on our experience of what in fact does happen. Once again, Kant offers both a semantic diagnosis of the origins of this epistemological predicament that makes this question seem urgent and difficult, and once again he offers a semantic response that, if successful, diffuses the epistemological worry. Sellers summarizes this Kantian thought in the title of one of his essays, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. It's a very long essay, and unfortunately that's the last intelligible sentence in the essay, but it's a wonderful title for it. A corresponding line of thought is to be mounted on the side of normative or practical necessity. Normative concepts make explicit commitments that are implicit in the practice of acting intentionally, in the exercise of practical agency itself. Intentional agency is a thoroughly normative phenomenon because it too consists in the application of concepts, and applying concepts is undertaking commitments and responsibilities whose content is articulated by those concepts. For Kant, specifically moral normative vocabulary makes explicit commitments that are already implicit in the practical use of any concepts to endorse maxims, ends, or plans. My point is that Kant's response to Hume's predicament, his account of the nature and expressive role of modal and normative, as he calls them, pure concepts, is not in fact as far removed from his discussion of the nature of freedom as might at first have appeared. Both are rooted in and developments of his normative term, his fundamental reconstrual of mind, meaning, and rationality in normative terms. Now, my aim in this talk has been to convey what in my title I called Some Kantian Lessons about what it is to have a mind, to grasp and apply meanings, to be rational. What I've been doing, you'll notice, is not really Kant exegesis. I haven't been concerned to interpret particular bits of his text so as to catch him expressing the views I've been attributing to him. That's an important and a necessary task, and in its absence I can at most claim to have been expounding Kantian lessons, not Kant's own theory. My characterization of Kant's largest ideas and their relations to one another deserves to be controversial, and it is